Very happy to welcome you all for coming this evening. As we know, Joan Jonas has been a pioneer and an innovator since the late 60s and has led the way for so many of us in this generation and in the next generation of young curators, of young artists, ongoing by completely creating an inimitable genre of her own. And in this respect, it is an honor and a privilege to work with you, to invite you here to the Thyssen-Bornemisza Museum, National Museum, and in view of an exhibition that you're going to create for us for next year in February during the Archival. But I wanted to also introduce Andrea. She's a sound curator, and very interestingly, of course, we all love working with sound, so a lot of this evening's talk is going to rotate around this subject. She founded Mana Records, some of you might have heard of, and she now works as with an incredible challenge to be the sound archivist for the National Museum, National Library in London. So I'm very honored and very pleased to have her. She's from Barcelona and has had a very international... You came from Barcelona? London. She's from Madrid. As we all meet new people when we enter onto the stage. And Stefanie Hessler, she started her career in many different strange places, but mainly she's from Sweden, so she actually was a studio manager for Carsten Höller for a few years. Then she joined the TBA21 Academy, which actually is the producer of the work that Joan will present here at the museum, which is part of the TBA21 collection. She also has written 2 incredible books with MIT Press. The last one has just come out this week, which I hope she will tell you a little bit about. But she has now entered her incredible career as a museum director in the Kunsthall of Trondheim in Norway. And I have rarely ever met in my life a curator that works as hard as you do. And still looks fresh as a daisy, always. So but anyway, I hope you enjoy the talk and conversation. We're starting a little bit late, but anyway, I hope when people come in a bit late, you'll make some space for them. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Francesca. And it's fantastic to be here again, a month after the exhibition More Than Humans opened, with Dominique Gonzalez-Förster and Thomas Saraceno here. I thought before we go into the panel, I give a bit of context for those of you who haven't seen the exhibition yet. Hopefully you will all go and see it. The exhibition brings together 2 artists who haven't really been shown, at least not in a 2-person exhibition, for strange reasons, maybe. And Francesca proposed to bring those 2 positions together, so I was tasked with the challenge to actually find a way to, to bring these two practices together. And a way for me to do that was to look at the more than human aspect, or that which is not necessarily only human. One important aspect in the exhibition also is sound. In the work of Dominique Gonzalez-Förster, there is a hologram where the artist lip syncs as the soprano, Maria Callas, to some of Callas's most famous arias. And she evokes the spirit of Callas in a kind of seance. Thomas Saraceno, as you all know, is an artist and researcher who works with many people from different disciplines, and he also collaborates with spiders. And we have here tonight with us some representatives of his studio as well, so if there are questions later about the work with spiders, I hope that you can help us answer them. Spiders don't have an auditory apparatus in a sense that they can't hear nevertheless, sound is an important aspect of how they navigate their worlds, and they can sense vibrations of sound in their webs, and they can take all sorts of decisions, and they can judge how far away a fly is, for example, or if there's a predator or whatever. They can sense that through sound, among other things. So going back to opera is considered one of the most advanced forms of culture, at least in Western culture. And I thought it was very interesting that we usually don't consider spiders as having culture. However, they build these incredibly ambitious structures and architectures in the form of their spider webs. They're part of the webs. The webs don't exist without them, and the spiders don't exist without the webs, so we cannot really think of those two things apart, which is also something that the studio of Tomás Saraceno is exploring. So as part of their vocabulary, they speak actually about spider webs as one word connected by a slash. And so what was interesting to me with this exhibition is how can we think about forms of knowledge that are not necessarily only understandable, graspable by the rational human mind. So among other things, the haunted, in the ghostly, this very emotional, enigmatic figure in Dominique González-Fürster's work, but also spiders with their very different sensory apparatuses, very different bodies from the human body. And to make the bridge to tonight, we have a wonderful panel here. I will be moderating and asking some questions. And the topic is human and non-human intelligence, connecting to the exhibition and to the topic of more than humans, but also bringing in some further aspects. Joan, as Francesca mentioned, will have the exhibition here at the museum in February next year, so it's a wonderful opportunity to talk to you and to introduce some of the themes of your work tonight. We will be showing images of the exhibition actually that was on view in Venice until recently, and the photographs are by Moira Ritchie. The works are all by Joan Jonas, and we will be playing them in the background just to give you an idea of what's to come here at the museum next year. If you have questions about anything specific in the photographs, let us know. We may be addressing some of them. So when I was preparing this panel, I was thinking about sound, clearly, because it connects to the exhibition. And one of the reasons why I find sound so important is because, especially throughout Western modernity, there has been a lot of focus on the visual sense. So the moderns and the explorers, colonizers, cartographers, etc., very much depended on a linear perspective and the grid that they used to create maps. So as they were exploring and colonizing countries far away, they depended very much on mathematical tools, etc., that had to do with perspective. At the same time, in art history, there was also the invention, so to speak, by Battista of the linear perspective, in which things can be subordinated to a grid. Again, the visual sense is extremely important. Tools such as the telescope have helped these discoveries, and later on also the camera. And while, of course, this is a very abridged history, these are some of the reasons why I think it's important to look into other senses as well, that are not just the visual, but, for example, also sound, the tactile, the olfactory, the taste, etc. And I believe that this embodied perspective, a feminist perspective, can actually help us find other ways of not trying to dominate and subordinate into a grid everything that we see. But it may tell us that we may not understand or not know everything. We may not understand how spiders sense, but we may know that they sense differently. Okay, and with that introduction, I would like to ask Joan. Joan, you have worked so much with different forms of art in your practice, among others, performance. So you were one of the first people actually embracing that new medium and combining it also with video and with sound. And I was curious to know how you consider knowledge in relation to performance, because it is not knowledge that we read about in books and in scientific journals, etc. But I was wondering, what do you think these media, or the use of different media that go away from only the visual, but that also include, moving image, for example, something that you cannot keep still or contemplate.
It all comes from forms that already exist, combining them.
Mm-hmm.
So from the very beginning, when I first started making the work that I do now, which in the 60s, I thought, well, how can I turn, I stepped from sculpture to performance, because in performance you can use a different medium and you don't have to be confined to an object. So just from the very beginning, I thought, because I studied art history, poetry, and film on my own, and I just combined those. I thought of them as interrelated mediums that you could put together, that you could take the structure of poetry, the structure of film, and you could make a performance based on that structure, or you could make a video. And so that's how I began to work with different forms. And then sound, I'll just mention I began with mirrors, and then I began to work with outdoor works. And I could just mention one sound piece. I made a film called Sound Delay, but it was based on a performance I did outdoors in a beach near New York, where one discovers, it's a very familiar experience, when you're far away from an action, and it depends on the atmosphere. If somebody goes like that, you don't hear it right away. There's a delay. And so that interested me. And that was my first sound piece. Very simple. We all know that experience. And so I'm not sure what you mean by knowledge, but it's the knowledge that one collects through dealing with materials. I'm very much a person who deals with actual materials. So taking blocks of wood and hitting them together, the wood, the sound of the wood. And the experience of how does distance, perceiving in a distance, affect what we see and what we perceive. It's about perception, really. And so now we're working with the ocean. We have a whole other sea of perceptions, underwater, whatever.
Mm-hmm. Can you maybe, I will put on the images, and while I do that, could you maybe speak a bit more about perception and underwater, or what interested you? Because the ocean is still, there are many depictions of it, but they are more or less always off the surface. There's diving footage, etc. But what interested you in, perception?
I was asked by Ultimate Bauer, who used to be one of your curators, and an old friend, to do a performance based on the ocean, because the whole subject of TBA21, which I admire, is about exploring and trying to save the ocean. And so I began, I guess it was 4 years ago, in Kochi, India, to put together a lecture demonstration based on my research. But before that, in Venice, I had in the pavilion, there were 4 rooms. One room was devoted to fish, one to bees, and one to the wind, and the other to children. So bring these elements together. Before that, I'm inspired by literature. It's a very important inspiration. I was reading Haldor Laxness's book, Under the Glacier, and that was before Venice, to make a piece which was later called Reanimation. But anyway, the minute I began to work with the idea of the glacier in the present, because I don't make historical pieces, they brought into the present, I thought of glaciers are melting. And that was my first step into dealing with the environment in that way. And then Haldor Laxness is a fantastic writer, and he writes about nature. The Icelanders, as you probably know, Icelandic people love their nature, the place where they live. They love it. It's so beautiful and magical. And the way he writes about nature is very poetic. So he wrote about bees in a very poetic way, which led me into working with bees. And then all these things are threatened. Everything is threatened now, the existence of all these creatures the wind now in California is causing huge wildfire. But I love the wind, but you know, it has its negative side. Anyway, but that's, I don't know if that was, I'm just...
Francesca, maybe this is a good point for you to come in, because your work with TBA21 is so much about protecting the oceans and about thinking of other ways to perceive them. And you've recently also developed a lecture performance dealing with sound, titled Sounds Too Many. Could you tell us a bit about that, for those of you who haven't seen it?
Maybe I could just answer your first bit of your question first. Because since, I think about 2006, although we started TBA21 in 2002, I felt that it was sort of an interesting challenge to personalize a collection and not buy what everyone else is buying at the art fairs. And very quickly, together with Daniela Zeman, the chief curator of the foundation, we started dealing with the most important topics of our time, which at the moment it was the enlargement of Europe, so issues of identity, of migration, the fear of Eastern Europe joining the European Union. There were a lot of interesting topics right there. And we commissioned a work by Kutlu Gataman at the time, a Turkish artist. And then, interestingly, about the Kurds in Turkey and the Kurdish population trying to retain its identity. And then we went into a number of social political commissions with artists like Amar Kanwar, who was here at the end of last year in this exhibition that was in the Monero rooms last year. And this continued and developed into a practice where we commissioned over 100 works, most of which dealt with an urgency of some kind. And it was sort of the way I felt was my way of contributing to society by using the voice that we'd been building up as you know, a very special foundation that had a very particular agenda. And to be an agency of change is a sort of a big ambition, but it is possible through the arts and culture to look at these topics that the media throw flames to, but to do so through the language of poetry and beauty and hope, through the lens of art, because those artists are, in fact, our greatest innovators and those ones who take the time to really research these topics. This project that you will see next year from Joan is 3 years in the making of numerous layers of different performances, different residencies and expeditions. I mean, so much has gone into this. Footage has been contributed from amazing marine biologists. There's so many layers to this. And I think at the end of the day, we created a sort of the exploratory soul of TBA21, which was called the TBA21 Academy. And that dedicated itself entirely to the oceans, because the environment itself is such a huge topic, which we did engage with through TBA. There was a focus on the oceans. There was this need to sort of deal with these oceans. And as a result, there have been another, 20 commissions that you were involved with, that Uta Metabauer was involved with, on the subject only on the oceans. And since next year is going to be the decade of ocean and science, dedicated by the United Nations, and this is a very, very important decade where we really need to face up to what we have done and continue to do to the oceans. And in the context of that focus, I decided that I wanted to adopt one of the many, many, many issues that concern the oceans and our environment, and that was sound pollution of the oceans. And I think we don't realize, because of the scale of the oceans, is so much larger than the scale of the living planet that we occupy, which is only actually 2% of the living space on Earth. The other 98% are actually the oceans and their entire volume, and all the way down to the bottom of the ocean as well. And these are surprising facts, and it would sort of explain why we humans actually take for granted that this ocean can be raped and pillaged and exploited without any restraint, that we can dump any amount of rubbish and sound into it without any restraint. Because in our view and in our minds, once in the ocean or out of the ocean, the waves just keep flowing and the surface of the ocean remains seemingly untouched. But everything underneath it is struggling to survive. And sound pollution is one of the biggest killers. And we forget when we see these groups of dolphins and whales that are beached all together, the media is very quick to qualify that these whales have probably just lost their way and they're so mindless that they tend to follow each other and do a mass suicide on a beach. But if marine biologists get to these animals in time, they will discover that they have massive brain hemorrhage, their eyes are blown, exploded, and all of that through the oil and gas industry that uses seismic guns to try to find pockets of oil underneath the bottom of the sea, using huge explosions of 250 decibels. So this lecture performance is absolutely popping with facts. And you go to a lot of talks, we go to a lot of talks, this is another talk. I mean, how many facts can anybody absorb? It is sometimes a little bit overwhelming. And I decided to turn it into a lecture performance where I actually took the sounds. Many of them came from our own exploration and own recordings. Others came from Scripps Institute of Oceanography. Others came from the NRDC in California. Others came from different institutions also throughout Europe. And these recordings have been made since the early 60s. And many of these sounds were completely new to mankind only 50 years ago. And we have, since then, there's an incredible science of the sounds of the oceans, but we also have to quantify that with the sounds of what we are exploding and the volume of sound that we pollute the oceans with every single day through transport companies. I mean, ever since we discovered online shopping, you know, the whole world is full of huge container ships crossing the oceans at incredible speed to get you your, you know, Balinese furniture to you within 2 weeks. So we use these things to supply us, to protect us in the navies, and also, let's face it, we all run our cars, so we need the gas that is below the ocean now. So we are actually the consumers of these sounds, and to get people to with empathy with our oceans, we need to actually hear what it is that we're doing. And sound is such an incredibly potent transmitter of emotions. It's like walking into the exhibition and hearing Maria Callas. I mean, this legend, this incredible voice of Maria Callas, it moves people to tears. And sound is not only music, it is also nature, the sounds of nature we don't hear nearly enough. And our empathy with nature really depends on these incredible field recordings that have been made by people over generations and then sort of how are manipulated. And I feel that's a really important part of archiving sounds as well. Mm-hmm. Sorry, I'm taking probably too long to understand. But it was a journey to get to that second question.
And you actually point exactly to this conundrum between facts and, kind of written down things that we can read about and their statistics, etc. But in the end, this kind of knowledge doesn't actually make us more intelligent, or at least it doesn't make us act in a more responsible manner. And this leads me to a question to you, which is relating also to, the work that Joan is doing and also to what Francesca just pointed to, that is storytelling. So you're working with this through sound, and you, work also with archives, etc. But maybe you could tell us a bit about the role of sound to communicate beyond the communication of information.
Okay. So just for context, and also to tie in with what you were talking about, these huge archives of wildlife sounds and field recordings. I work at the British Library in London, which is home to the UK's National Sound Archives. And in and amongst the many different things that we collect are wildlife recordings. So for example, we have lots of recordings of now extinguished species. And in a similar vein, this year the UNESCO has designated 2019 as Year of Endangered Languages. In the section or the department that I work in, we work with ethnographic or ethnomusicological, anthropological sound recordings, which often contain not only music and sort of performance and ritual, but also endangered languages. So I'm also, basically trying to navigate the 6.5 million sound recordings at this institution and finding kind of compelling ways to storytell and to create not only intellectual experiences, but also sensorial experiences and ways of actually tapping into the sort of neurological effects that sound can have over memory, for example. So we have currently, these are institutional projects, but projects with people who are suffering from dementia or early Alzheimer's, and then also projects with people who are sight impaired. And so exploring what is unique to sound, which is the ability to communicate knowledge through a non-visual medium, which you were talking about earlier. But in my personal curatorial practice, or say when I'm asked by the BBC or another radio station, can you bring one sound and tell us why sound archiving and sort of collecting the world's sounds, although that collecting is a bad word these days, but let's say preserving the world's sounds is important. What I try and do is I try and bring the sound and also the context or the way in which that sound was actually made. What were the circumstances in which that sound was made? And in order to bring, and that's what's so important about working with archives, actually. It's not just, I try and really tell this to our artists and residents. You can't just sample, some Yoruba chanting from Nigeria and then combine it with a candomblé drumming from Cuba and sort of expect that the meaning that's kind of condensed into those sound waves is going to translate and communicate to people. You have to also bring the context and the circumstances in which those recordings were made, which obviously in the case of the British Library Sound Archive can be very much linked with like political histories of colonialism. So I think the storytelling and storytelling with sound archives has a lot to do with finding the right balance between that background story. So what is happening in that recording that isn't audible, which sounds like a paradox actually, because I work with sound, but actually I'm also interested in how were they recording, what was the recording technique they were using, because this is funny, but some people, they imagine, well, in the 80s when, for example, wax cylinders, which is one of the earliest formats that sound recordings were made on, when those started to become digitally available, people listened to Native American music from the early 20th century for the first time. And they said, oh, how interesting. Native American music is always 4 minutes, 3 minutes long. And it's like, well, actually, no, that's, how long is this piece of string, basically? How long is a wax cylinder? So these sorts of either technical, contextual, political, geographical, all these stories that are happening in order to make that sound exist is what, for me, is important as someone working with sound archives. But because I'm working with historical sound, I mean, as someone who also publishes like contemporary dance music, in that sense, I'm interested in albums that also have a narrative element, but that's more about bringing people into a space in which they can feel transformed as they go in and come out of it. So the pure listening experience, let's say, the storytelling involved in that is a more physical, sensorial, where does your mind wander to? But I think with archives, there's a sense of responsibility that needs to be respected, and so there's those two different approaches kind of coalesce in what I do.
Mm-hmm. Great.
Yeah.
Huge challenge.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
I'm working on it. I'm not, you know.
I'm
just
bowing
telling you
towards-
what.
It's so important what you do. So important.
Yeah, I mean, it's.
So, didn't mean to jump in.
No,
there.
no. I mean, it's also this challenge of how do you, preserve something that maybe isn't meant for preservation, and how do you record something where the context can be described but never really transmitted. I mean, I think those are super interesting questions, and there's no easy answer, I guess.
No, like going back to what Joan was saying about poetry. I don't know if this is working. Yeah. Poetry and art history and objects. Oftentimes when you work with collections of sound recordings that don't come with documentation, written documentation, so field notes, that's when you have to start, you have to become creative about the research you do to actually figure out. Like I brought a sound today, which I don't really know much about, actually, because the only traces I could find of the documentation are just sort of indexical notes. But nowadays, lots of ethnomusicologists have veered away from this indexical approach to annotating what they're recording, and they're trying to combine more, what's called ethnopoetics, and sort of use more contemporary or more creative and open approaches to actually describing, right, what's on this object was actually this whole performance that took place over 3 nights. And actually, how can you convey that to then a future researcher who's going to be sitting in a neutral library reading room? Well, maybe the solution is to combine poetics in order to describe these objects that are often boundaryless even though they're bound to an object.
Yeah. And I mean, this is also what you do, Joan. I mean, when we were preparing the exhibition in Venice, we were walking around the city looking for objects, a lot of objects in antique stores with a lot of history. Mm-hmm. So, and thinking about animism, etc., or intelligence that is not only maybe within humans, but also in objects and in sort of the, histories that they acquire. And I know that this is something that you're interested in your work as well, and ritual, etc. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah. Well, in studying art history, I was always interested in going to the beginning. How do things begin? So Minoan and Mycenaean, the earliest, they're not ancient, but the earliest forms of Western expression, and then, of course, the cave paintings, which I've been seeing in Spain, which are amazing. But anyway, so going to the beginnings of things, which was ritual. Art begins in ritual. And so from the very beginning, I'd like to experience, go to see rituals of other cultures. Not that many, but I mean, I was very lucky to see the Hopi snake dance. And that's a combination of working with snakes, and they hold the snakes in their mouths. I was very lucky. I went to New Mexico. I heard that they were happening. It was in the 60s. And I went to New Mexico and I saw these amazing dancers. They capture the snakes in the desert and then they keep them in the kiva and tame them so that they're perfectly safe for them to be holding in their mouths. And then at the end, when they finish this ritual, they release the snakes back into the desert. But the thing is that I couldn't record it out of respect. You can't record anything on the Hopi. We have to respect their culture and also the way they've been treated in the U.S. Abby Warburg, a famous German historian, took a lot of photographs and which are available. But so I couldn't really touch that material. I could not show any kind of visual representation of it or influence. However, I did do a piece based on Abby Warburg's writing, so I entered it again. But the Hopi, for instance, the Hopi culture is such an amazing visual culture. Their drawings and their objects are incredible. So I always thought, well, everybody should know about this, but it's not I don't have the right to tell people about it. The Hopi have that right. But that's what you have. Some of the problems with dealing with ethnographic material is now they have to tell the story. We can't tell. I mean, I don't know. It must be an interesting problem.
Yeah, that's a big sort of trend or strand in the work we do. It's about co-curation and also reconnection. So currently I'm working with a collection of sound recordings that were made in the 1960s in Colombia, in 5 different parts of Colombia with different ethnic groups. And these were made on what was called the Anglo-Colombian Recording Expedition. Expedition's also a bad word these days. So it was 2 young men, 25 and 29 years old. They were not ethnomusicologists. In their own words, they weren't trained ethnomusicologists, but they knew how to make collections. So this is something that in the 60s was obviously, it was prevalent. But nowadays, what was done already was those sound recordings were taken back to the different communities that were recorded, and they were sort of integrated into these digital kiosks that the government of Colombia set up from the 1990s onwards in the very rural regions of the country. So that was a whole reconnection project which was filmed and turned into a documentary. And now what we're doing is working to get those same sound recordings at the National Sound Archive in Colombia, and also facilitate all the associated documentation, which is only in the English language, even though it documents maybe, aside from Spanish, obviously, maybe 10 different indigenous languages to Colombia. So trying to get that documentation translated also. And then what might happen is something, an exhibition, if there's any scope for doing more creative or sort of things that will be beyond the institution, it would always be a question of co-curating these materials with people who are actually implicated in the communities that are represented in them. So yeah, that's a clearly a big strand in the storytelling, let's say.
We experienced during the expeditions of TBA21 Academy through the Pacific, numerous challenges, namely, these post-colonial issues that people are reinterpreting and reusing and not respecting. And as you say, Joan, asking it should be them telling their story. But there's one thing that strikes me a bit strange about what you just said, was that there was somebody with you that took numerous photographs, and that became a big documentary.
No, I said Abby Warburg, who at the beginning of the 20th century went to the Hopis. He was a German banker, and he gave up his position in the banking hierarchy to collect books. And then he went to the Hopis in the beginning of the 20th century, and that's when he took photographs. But at that time, there wasn't this same attitude anthropologically. But the trouble with him was he did not ever write about what was happening to the Native Americans at the time. They were being, badly treated.
But you felt it was inappropriate to record them.
It is
sensitivity.
No, it's not me feeling it. You're forbidden to take photographs in the Hopi reservation. And also, all of being an American, I don't know how many Americans are here. As an American, I cannot use or represent the Native Americans. I just can't. It's just... So I went through Abby Warburg because I was so fascinated with what I saw. It was such a big experience for me. Now, since then, I've been to Japan, and I've been very influenced by the no drama, but there's a whole different relationship there of hierarchies, you know what I mean? So it's very complicated anyway.
I mean, this
It's
is a
interesting, though, to
Yeah.
understand this. It's really very
I mean,
valuable.
it's a huge challenge, and I think it's extremely important also that, you know, the rules are not always made by those who have the possibility to go or who have been the people who have led expeditions, etc. But, you know, to give space and to actually listen, you know, and not to always transmit and to always impose, but actually just let, you know, be and not take ourselves so seriously for a moment. This applies, of course, also to how we treat nature and this whole divide between nature and culture, or that we don't consider ourselves as part of nature. Where, you know, to go back to the exhibition here, actually, and the collaborations that Thomas and his studio are doing with spiders, I think that that's a really interesting way to consider co-creation, to consider things that are being made not by or, you know, for or whatever, but with another creature. And I think that, you know, enabling or creating a sort of support structure for things that can happen and for others, be they human or non-human, is actually, that's super important. And I mean, maybe Francesca, you can say something about that, because I know that TBA21 is also, you know, aiming to be such an instigator for collaborations and a platform where things can happen, where people come together.
Well, that's one of the really greatest things about sound, actually, because it is a very specialized skill. And to integrate it into any work of art, unless you're Joan, is usually requires collaboration. And I think a lot of the work since The Morning Line, which we did back in 2008, maybe 7 or 8 or 9, I can't remember, but was a huge sculptural, architectural work by an American artist called Matthew Ritchie, who collaborated with Arup and Aranda Lash. And then after this was largely designed over a period of about 4 years, we thought about performance, about video, and I was suggesting sound, because I always had this little secret passion for sound. And we encouraged by somebody called Tony Myatt in London, in the University of Sussex, he was at York at the time, who was creating ambisonic sound systems. So what became really an obsession of mine was these incredible 3D sound environments that really were the pioneering work behind what you now mainly hear in cinemas. So if, you know, an avatar shoots an arrow in a 3D movie at you, you not only will see this arrow going towards you, you will also hear it going. And this is done through these incredible immersive soundscapes, which is actually the technology that I used for Sounds Too Many. But those type of the sort of experimentations into sound and creating these soundscapes that were very, very complicated and elaborate. At the time, we were working with over 100 speakers, all developed by Meyer Sound Labs in California, which is really one of the greatest sound systems in the world. And we've been working with them ever since, with Jana Winderen, creating installations inside the exhibition that you created, Tidalectics, that turned on and off at every time the tide changed, would be coming in or would be going out in the exhibition. Obviously, there was no ocean right there in the museum. But this was really to give people a central experience of that incredible sound. And it was, again, spatialized with Meyer. And I think it's something that really becomes a very particular language. And that sort of experience is, as I said, is really, for me at least, is really helps to develop the type of empathy that we seem to have lost with nature. Our connection with nature is so polluted by the sounds of the street and the sounds of our phone and the sounds of the TV. I mean, we're just deaf to it. And being able to reprogram it into a space and give people that real sensory experience where you just close your eyes and you float immediately into another space with that sound. You transformed into a listening device, because we don't listen anymore, and very rarely. And that experience that I had with Jana, sort of literally putting a pair of headphones on, we were in the middle of the ocean. Like, no, we didn't see another vessel or an island or a reef all around us, because we were chasing the elusive singing whale, because we were surrounded by hundreds of whales, all of whom were singing, and it was impossible to get the recording of just one. So we had gone really far with this tender, and I was with Chris Watson and Diana, the two great sound artists, and they had their hydrophones over the edge. I got a spare pair of earphones, and they said, just listen. And I literally went into a trance. I think probably got the worst sunburn in my life. And I listened to this sound of this singing whale over and over. Each song is about 27 minutes. And but what was interesting about that experience, it's not just the whale. I was hearing a whale singing in real time at that moment, probably somewhere very close to where I was. But I actually also could hear how sound travels in water, which is completely different than in air. It's 3 times the speed, goes 10 times as far, and the density of the water is a huge carrier of sound, which makes sound pollution an even bigger problem. But the sound of nature with Richard Payne, who you talked about yesterday evening, who was probably the first marine biologist who discovered the sound of the blue whale, which sounds really, really particular. But he was recording humpback whales singing, and he produced an album back in the 70s, and it went platinum, molten platinum. It was the first album. Nobody had ever heard a whale before. And this was at the time where the Beatles and Santana and Grateful Dead and Neil Young and all of those guys were going platinum. And to have a whale album go platinum, alongside John Lennon and Yoko Ono is pretty cool. and those were the moments where people started connecting to that. And this was really what shifted people's attention to whales, because at the time they were being hunted down and they were nearly extinct. And this huge movement of Save the Whales came out of that, just that people were able to hear these incredible creatures. And just this experience of having that in myself and personal, that completely shifted my perception of sound. Because sound underwater is just another experience. And
I've been thinking now while you were talking actually about the feminist theorists Vicky Kirby and Astrida Neymanes, who think about how we can overcome not just the separation between nature and culture, but also the separation of the thing and its representation. So how can we, get beyond speaking on behalf of, or speaking for, speaking about? And I don't really know the answer, but in terms of image creation, photography, moving image, etc., I've been thinking that it would be fascinating to, find ways for, and I mean, photography is a way to do that in a way, it kind of imprints itself directly onto a photographic paper, but how to find ways to overcome that sort of separation, or to, translate so that it's not about the thing and it's represented and those things can be seen separately, but how to translate it. And that brings us back actually to poetry and, also what you're doing in your work. And I would love to know more about how you bring together different materials. Mm-hmm. So, both objects, but also literary sources, moving image, and now for this piece in particular, Moving Off the Land too, you worked with a marine biologist and oceanographer called David Gruber, who provided you with some of his materials. So could you talk about these very different sensibilities and different materials?
Well, I work with the materials themselves. I put them together. And it's not something I conceive of. I actually physically either I have an object or it's video. I went to the aquariums, just to speak about David Gruber. One thing TBA21 does is they don't impose anything on you. So I met David Gruber at a gathering you had, and I read about him, and I decided I wanted to work with him because the work he does concerns how fish perceive. And one thing I'm very interested in is perception, of course. And so I thought, and I was studying fish in my own way, and the ocean, and also working with mythology. You know, how do I begin in my work? Well, I began with a mermaid also. And I think the mermaid represents some kind of strange memory because we come from the sea. And that's hard to imagine, but we do come from the sea. So I think the human race has some kind of bodily memory of this transition. And so they, especially not now, you know, we're separated from that now. But the people who lived on the sea and worked on the sea, they saw the creatures and they could imagine themselves there. Anyway, but David Gruber has developed, he's very interested in how his whole project was until now, it's slightly shifted. How do fish perceive? How do they see? What do they see? Not what they hear. By the way, we have the same structure of semicircular canals as whales have, for instance, and other physical similarities. But so David has developed cameras and lenses. He's had them built. He takes them underwater and he photographs phosphorescent fish so he can, you know, things that we cannot see, his camera sees. So there's a phosphorescent turtle, and there are many fish who have a phosphorescence that we can't see. And so that's why I wanted to work with David. And so then he was very generous, and he gave me footage that he shot underwater, which I added to my footage. Marine biologists probably hate aquariums. For me, the aquarium was the only place that I could, I mean, unless I went diving, which I don't do, haven't done yet. But anyway, so that would be the place where I could go and actually look at fish. And so a lot of my footage is from, I think some aquariums are better than others, and more, children can learn so much from going to aquariums. But anyway, so I began to work with David. He gave me footage, and he came to visit me in Canada and shot my dog. And I have a dog, and I've always had dogs. And
He shot your dog?
Yeah, he did. With
he
a camera.
filmed your dog. Nobody would shoot your dog and get away with it.
No, I used the word shoot for recording. Anyway, so that's how I began to work with a marine biologist. We're still friends, and probably I want to keep in touch with him because it's so. And then so in the show here, I asked David if I could use. He was also recording the sound of sperm whales. Now, and it's a very different sound from these humpback whale. The sperm whale is a clicking sound, and it's very abstract. And they're trying to figure out what they're saying to each other. So the whales are communicating with each other with these clicks, and it's fascinating. So I have in the piece you'll hear a recording of these clicks that we've edited a little bit to change a little bit. But anyway, so.
I mean, in your work, there are always these different characters, like you said, your dog, or also your previous dogs, and you mentioned wind earlier. One of the works of yours, earlier works that I really like, is actually titled Wind, where you see different figures being blown around by the elements, and it's quite simple, but this force of nature where you're not separate from it, but it completely affects you.
I love the wind.
Yeah.
And whenever I like to perform in the wind for myself. I mean, I put the camera up and go out there with a costume and a flag, and I like to work with what the wind does. Mm-hmm. It's a character in a way. Anyway.
I think that it would be also very, so you've incorporated a lot of children who have actually grown up over the years with you, performing in various videos from quite a young age, that are now quite teenager How did that come into the work? Sorry to butt in and ask
I'll just
questions.
quickly
but
say that
yes.
beginning to work with nature and what's happening, it's very, I mean, if you look, you can get really depressed. And I mean, scientists get depressed. You know, we all do. If you read in the newspaper, if you read every day, the fish can't smell anymore. And they depend on getting food by smelling. That's one thing that's really, I mean, that's just one of the many examples. And I didn't want to make a piece about the tragedy, but I included children, because by juxtaposing children in the work, the children perform, they do a bee dance, for instance, and they speak, and they see what we're working with, they see the fish and the bees. By juxtaposing children with this material, the children aren't going to inherit this situation that we are part of now. And I wanted to make that point without being didactic. So I didn't want to, I wanted to show the beauty, like an octopus that I visited several times in Boston at the New England Aquarium. I can go backstage and look at the octopus to see what, they're miraculous, and bees are miraculous. You know, what they do, that's what held our laxness. The fact that a bee can carry the pollen and then make the honey, it's miraculous. And then the beehive, the bee can build the beehive. It's an octagon. It's amazing. And it's the same structure, I was trying to ask you, as the eyes, you know, it's the most stable structure. So anyway, all these incredibly, I think it's miraculous. Nature is miraculous. So I wanted to show that with the children who also can, it's very important the children learn now about what still exists before it disappears. That's the way I feel.
That's also maybe why archives are important, you know, to preserve, as you mentioned. But maybe one last question to you, and then we can open up to questions from the audience, would be what else can archives do? Can they do something for non-humans?
There's this really funny, well, the title is really funny, but there's this radio program that the BBC produced about it's called something like, gosh, it's something about how it's like termites in the archive or something like really menacing where insects are the protagonists. And your question sort of frivolously makes me think about pests and pest control, which is like the only non-human presence. I mean, at least by non-human, do you mean animal or do you mean mechanical?
It can be anything. I mean, you know, we can think about algorithms, we can think about animals.
Yeah. Well, I
ghosts,
think, it's interesting, aside from the insects, which are obviously like a huge menace to the physical carriers on which sound is stored, like wax cylinders, for example, are quite, well, it's actually quite beautiful because just thinking about what you were saying about bees, wax cylinders, for those of you who don't know, are literally cylinders coated with wax. And upon this surface is inscribed, through the pressure of sound, it's a mechanical way of recording, so it doesn't require electricity. It's what Edison invented, the phonograph, basically. And funnily enough, the phonograph was marketed through animals a lot, actually. There were always images of animals kind of, well, in disbelief, if an animal can show that. And in fact, Nipper the dog, the EMI logo, he couldn't believe it was his master's voice. So there's always something from the very beginnings of phonography about how animals have reacted to this capacity of sound to reproduce living presence. But, you know, in fact, it's a haunting, it's a duplication with a delay, as you were saying. There's even a really silly little article about a farmer in the US at the beginning of the 20th century, like 1910 or something, who was having his hens listen to clucking so that and he was discovering that they would lay more eggs because they were sort of incited by their own sound. So, I mean, aside from all of that kind of silly business, and then the termites in the archive and wax as a wax cylinder, but also as a menace, I think, like right now, what the Google, experiments with Google, for example, has made some really interesting uses of machine learning with whale sounds. And it's on their public, I mean, by no means am I representing them, but this, I thought, was a really interesting application of how non-human intelligence can interact with the archive, because essentially, you know, obviously from an artificial intelligence point of view, and basically when you feed all that data that an archive's accumulated, obviously the first challenge is getting it in a sort of organized form, and that's like what we're doing. You know, catalogers are trying to make it machine readable. And I think there's still a long way to go with certain types of materials. Once that happens, then, I mean, the possibilities are endless. And with sonification, for example, that's another super interesting avenue that can be explored in terms of discovery and access to archives. So, as far as I'm concerned, non-human intelligence has always and will always be part of what archives can do. One last thing, the phonograph was at the beginning of sound recording history when Edison first launched in 1888, the talking machine. I always think it's interesting how advertisements and accounts of using it were humanizing the machine, but always mentioning it as a machine or as a mechanical presence. So lots of ethnographers, for example, were talking about how does this mechanical presence interfere or sort of interrupt my interaction with the Hopi elder that I'm trying to record. So I don't know, there's a lot to think about from the origin and also towards the future with machine learning especially.
Yeah, and also all the things that we can learn from organisms that are often considered not very intelligent, like the slime mold, for example, that is still used to model, you know, transport systems, etc., because it is able to find the fastest way to food.
Yeah.
So, you know, what we consider intelligence is also maybe, yeah.
And through spiders and their
That
use of
too,
vibration, obviously. I mean, it's incredible, but the Bushmen in Namibia, a certain group called the, I won't say it with click language because I don't know how to pronounce it, but the Juohansi also use vibration and think of their sort of universe as a spider web in the sense that all animals are engaged and interacted and interdependent. And they're speaking about vibration in ways that aren't dissimilar or that could be put in dialogue with this way that spiders are spoken about in Saraceno's practice. So there's a lot to investigate there. I think it's exciting times for...
And elephants communicate with vibration.
Oh, yeah?
Yes, when they
Okay.
walk, they communicate across distances.
That's right.
Yeah.
The reason I brought this particular sound recording was because of TBA21's work in Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands and this part of the world. So just as background, at the British Library Sound Archive, the first sound archive to be founded is the Vienna Phonogram Archive, and more or less the second archive is the Berlin Ethnological Museum, which has huge collections of wax cylinders. This recording, which we're about to play, is from the Berlin Phonogram Archive. It's from a collection that was called the Berlin Demonstration Cylinders, which were essentially created by two disciples of Carl Stumpf, who was a psychologist who founded this museum. And his disciples, von Hornbostel and I forget the other person's name, they were compiling demonstrations of how the phonograph could be used to record other cultures. this is not by them in particular, it's by someone else called Ernst Fritzi, who I have yet to find more out about. But basically, I thought, okay, I'm going to bring one of the early sound recordings, 1911. A lot of people haven't heard what a wax cylinder sounds like. It has a lot of surface noise. It's played back at a really high speed, which you'll hear the engineer say when he digitizes it. And it's a fascinating song or chant from Bougainville Island, which is in the northern, it's part of Papua New Guinea, but it's in the northwestern Solomon Islands. I mean, I've never been, okay, you've been there, so I've never been there, but I just think, geez, you know, that distance and that I can actually be, well, let's hear what you guys feel from it, but when I first heard it, I found it incredibly compelling and wild, and wild in the emotions. Obviously, I don't understand the language that it's in, but let's hear it, hopefully at a loud volume, and through that surface noise, you can hear the chanting, and it's the language is here. This is all the metadata, is what it's called. It's just so you have a bit of context. I don't know about that. That's the thing. I mean, I'm ashamed that I haven't brought more information. All I know is what I could find in the publication, and again, that's the big challenge, that you often are encountered with something that is at a huge distance from you. But based on what you were saying, even through the sound and through the singing, which is a sort of universal human language, even though I don't speak Nasai, I can hear the melody and I can feel the emotion, and then the research can be done further ahead, hopefully.
Are they trying to transfer all these wax discs to digital so that it's somehow preserved?
They've
like
been
in the museum?
digitized already.
All the ones in Berlin, for instance, they've all been digitized?
I can't speak
Yeah,
for...
but in London, all the
In
ones,
London,
yeah.
all the wax cylinders have been preserved at the Library of Congress. That was one of the first formats to be preserved. In the US, for example, at the Library of Congress, it was the Federal Cylinder Project, which took place in the 80s. So, yeah, because it's such a fragile format.
Yeah, I can see that.
It's prone to mold and dust and termites and all sorts of non-human.
And human. Any other questions? Okay.
I'll ask Joan a question.
Yes. Ask Joan a question.
How did you were talking about the Hopis, being with the Hopis, and then in Japan, and just wanted to hear you talk more about how those experiences factored into your own artwork, or how did you relate with them? How did you feel?
The Hopi, I tried not to have it factor at all, except the idea of distance, because I saw the Hopi, the snake dance was on the top of the, what do you call whatever. And then the next day I saw something called the butterfly dance, which started out far away in the desert and came closer and closer. So I think that probably the idea of distance, but in a very abstract way. But I could not in any way, I just I can't let it affect my work in any kind of visual or auditory way. Except that in a general way, because I am very influenced by, and with work of other cultures, I'm very careful. For instance, the coyote, which I included in the Warburg piece, many cultures use the coyote. The coyote is part of their, an animal that is part of their language, and, like the trickster. And if it exists in many cultures, I think that I, as a whatever, can have it in my piece. But then in Japan, it's a whole other, we have another different kind of relation. But I saw the No Theater, and I saw Kabuki Theater, and the Japanese. These theaters are they're genius at making special effects with very little material, with paper, with wood. And the No Theater in particular, they have very simple wooden structures as props, and they have a piece of paper and they go like that and it flies across the room. So for me, those magical effects with very simple materials, paper I love as a material. And then the use of masks. After the trip to Japan, I started working with masks. Of course, that's not confined to any one culture, so I collect masks. And I never tried to imitate any of these things, but and then the Japanese, the Western theater is very much based on text and kind of more realism, and I was never interested in the beginning to work with those elements. So Artaud was also influenced by other cultures, and so I knew about Artaud. And so when I saw the No Theater, which is a visual musical theater, there's sound, it's dance, there's a story too, but as a foreigner, I didn't understand the story, but I was totally transfixed by just the movement and the sound. They have people sitting on the edge with drums, and they sing in a very specific way. So I started working with masks. I did use a lot of, I have to say, kimonos, a few kimonos, but, and just the general, what I just mentioned, the simplicity of the props. So I've continued whenever I'm begin a piece, not whenever, but many times. Also, Irish poets were influenced by the No, because the stories have to do with ghosts and spirits, which exist in Irish myth and poetry and storytelling. And so every time I get stuck, I reread these No dramas, and I don't really use them, but I have recently used some of the phrases. So anyway, it's like a little bit like that.
That's what I think is so fascinating, among other things, in your work, but also in Dominique's work, in Tomas's work, is that you create your own language. But there are elements that people can recognize, such as structures, such as sounds, etc., that that relate to many different cultures and contexts. So I think that that's something quite magical, to create something new out of all sorts of different
That's what
materials.
Culture, isn't that what culture is?
It is what culture is, yeah.
And art too.
And art, yeah. I mean, it's in the visual arts, it's a little more complicated. In sound and music, I think there's more freedom, because musicians can work. They can really draw on different cultures without having it be too much of a problem. Don't you think?
Thank you.
No, not really.
Huge
We'll talk.
Yeah, we can talk.
Yeah. I think
yes,
there's a question.
No, yo quería preguntar, sobre todo a Andrea Zarza, ¿cómo piensa ella el futuro? En el sentido de que el mundo está cada vez, el hombre está cada vez más cosificado por un lado. Su interacción con la naturaleza es cada vez más distante, por no decir prácticamente ajena. ¿Cuál es el futuro? ¿Cómo lo veis? Porque realmente el futuro es tristísimo. Por lo menos la perspectiva que podemos ver no es nada optimista.
If you don't mind, would you summarize the question in one sentence or two, and then before you and answer in English? Because yeah, we don't
basically saying, gracias por la pregunta. Basically, she's asking, what do we think about the future, in the sense that we're at a sort of turning point where we're more and more distanced from nature, and all these technological advancements that we're speaking about today are very laudable, but at the same time, how do they factor into a sort of pessimistic vision of the future, especially in relation with nature and the human?
Can I answer that? Can I take it on? Can I answer in English?
Yes.
I mean, I think the magic that the artists of our time have developed this new language, and they are the antennas of our world. They are the greatest receptors. They take their time to research. They do huge field work. There is a huge connection, and they have their own language that I think is more filled with hope than with fear. That we can leave to the media. Media lives off fear. If we believed everything we read, we wouldn't be able to get up in the morning. So there is such an Armageddon theory that just keeps coming at us all the time and generates fear. And the issue is some people definitely needed to be shocked into reality. It is true that a lot of activist groups needed to get this information out there, but it is fear-driven. And the investment that I think TBA21 has made over the years, working with artists, addressing these topics, is in order for the poetry to come through, in order to give people a sense of hope, and in order to really investigate these topics across disciplines. Because any journalist, I mean, very often what we do, we get a journalist saying, well, we don't know where to put this, in the cultural section or in the scientific section or the environmental section, because our own media is so subdivided. But actually, in real life, as you know, these questions are not answerable through one discipline only. You know, all of the solutions that we are inevitably going to have to find, they come through interdisciplinary research and collaboration with a sense of generosity and a strong value system that guides us. And this, at the moment, I think is in the hands of the artists. And I don't, you know, they are the most respected voice out there, because there's not an artist that will go out there and lie. I don't think so.
No.
You may have different opinions, and it's again like the same thing with journalism. People will come and approach something from different perspectives, but I really believe that we can rely on them to be able to translate different forms of knowledge. So different research, different forms of knowledge, different approaches to things, and bring it together into one work that people can look at and go, that's interesting, because then you are invited to make up your own mind about this, whereas the media will tell you what you need to think. And that's why we're so divided, because everything is polarized today. So really what I'm looking for in an artist's work is somebody who can unfold all of these issues and questions in their own way, with their own sense of creativity and poetry and language, that does not point fingers. It is not a blame game, but it is an opportunity for us to investigate and to understand things just from a different perspective. Because most important thing of all is that you and I make our minds up about something. We will have to decide how to live our lives, not point the finger and tell other people how to live.
I have to say that I slightly disagree with you, because I don't think the artists, I don't think it's up to the artists. I think it's, the artists can contribute, and everything you're saying is true.
Yeah.
Yes, what the artists can contribute. But we need the activists. Right now, it's a dire situation. We need the activists. I always wonder why my students aren't marching in the street if they knew what the situation is now. Do you know what I mean? So we need all these different groups. And I've actually learned a lot from the media in my research when they review a book by a scientist about how fish feel. Do you know what I mean? So I don't discount the media. Yes, I think there is an element of fear. In America, it's just terrible right now, blah, blah, blah. But it's up to the activists also, and it's up to everybody in this room to work in their own way, to try to, like Jeff Bezos, the head of, what's it called? Amazon. He wanted to use, I mean, I think also technology, I just want to use the analogy of a knife. A knife can kill somebody, and it can also cut bread. Do you know what I mean? So that's true of all technology. And Jeff Bezos wanted to use, what do you call those things that fly through the air?
Drones.
He wanted to use drones to deliver packages faster. To me, that is pure evil, and it should be, we have to protest against, I mean, somehow. So the artists are not going to affect those changes, because people like Jeff Bezos do not care about artists. You know what I mean? And there's greed. Greed is one of the, anyway, sorry, I'm just.
But there's, for instance, there's an amazing project.
Okay.
There is a great project with drones to bring medicine to people in the Amazon, and to bring people medicine and much needed things. So there are really
Doctors
good
Without Borders.
Doctors Without Borders, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, there's different ways of using technology, of course, but what I think is, yeah, I mean, I agree that we need everybody to, you know, consider what they want to do. We need different perspectives, which can, among others, be contributed by artists. But we also need people to act, and not just individuals, also corporations that need to be held accountable, accountable, and, you know, governments need to act. It cannot all be, you know, put on the individual either. But anyway, this is a different discussion.
Just a historical anecdote, but when the phonograph came into use by anthropologists and ethnographers at the end of the 19th century, so in 1890, when people like Francis Densmore or Jesse Walter Fuchs or Bela Bartok in Hungary were starting to record folkloric expressions in their different countries, there was a lot of sort of urgency. There was a sense of urgency to what they were doing. This is what is called salvage ethnography. So they were trying to save the old world, which was being sort of pushed to the side by the new world of modernity, of railroads, of progress, essentially. And there's a paradox in the fact that they were using an instrument from the new world, which was the phonograph, precisely to salvage and to, you know, obviously to keep not the living thing, but a sort of the dead letter in the shape of a recording. But that just makes me think, well, yes, all these technologies, artificial intelligence, and machine learning, and all these new technologies that we've been speaking about today, there is a paradox in their use, but perhaps we don't yet know, and we don't yet know what their sort of end result is going to be. I mean, people have been speaking about disappearing cultures and languages for a whole century, and obviously too much harm's been done, and the future is sort of black. But I think with strong ethical committees and pressure on companies like Google, such as the in London with the Extinction Rebellion, the sit-in where all these women were nursing their babies, we can work together to re-educate maybe in a more ethical use of these technologies, and the outcome will be what the phonograph has given us today, which is being able to hear something which otherwise isn't here in that same shape and form. I don't know, there's a paradox with
No, but
technology.
like the film camera was developed by the army,
Yeah.
by military. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So and also I think what the archives are doing, it's it's amazing actually to save this material for us to know about the past, so it's not lost totally.
I want to just close with one last remark. One of the most moving moments in your exhibition when it was installed in Venice was that we, were introduced again to these young children that you have in the videos, and we came out of the exhibition, and one of these Friday strikes, school strikes, was happening in Venice, and the whole square in front of Ocean Space was full of children and demonstrating and striking, and that collaboration, with the children that were in the videos about the ocean, and seeing these students, coming outside Ocean Space and demonstrating. So I do agree with you that both worlds need to, and they do interact. But I think also very much the art world was underestimated for a long time, that it could contribute something to that conversation.
Well, I think artists have I don't think every artist has to be responsible and include political, but I think artists who are certain kinds of artists have a responsibility to respond to the present time in a way, in a not overtly political way. I mean, that's just the way I feel. So I don't put that on other artists, but I think that's one thing the art world how it can function.
So we agree.
Yeah.
Okay, on that note, thank you very much for coming, and yeah, thank you.